Let's give it a try.
Yep.
Does that work? Oh, sweet. Yeah, it's perfect.
Okay. And then you should be able to bounce around and stuff like that a little
Like
bit.
back and forth.
Yeah. I kind of. Yes, ma'am. Okay, I'm coming. Okay, so there's that guy for you. Okay, I will come back and check on you in just a minute to make sure that you're good.
Let's try it again. Just the arrows?
Yeah. Is it not working?
Oh, wait. How do you do that?
Well, seriously.
It worked right there, but I pressed wrong. I don't know what button I pressed here.
We lived there for a little bit back in the
Oh, so it's this bottom button?
Oh, is the bottom button?
Yeah. It only goes one way.
Okay.
Right here, back.
Okay.
So let's try this one more time. What's that do? I suppose I can just press it. That'll work.
So now I think if you just hit the arrow keys.
Yeah. All right.
Okay. Sorry about that. I'll see if I can find you a. Yeah. Just give me 1 second to see if I can figure this out.
I'll go ahead and get started, so you can stay on time.
Kelly. Hey, Steve. Sorry.
So thanks for coming. Appreciate it. Hey, my name is Joel Glad. I'm from CWI, College of Western Idaho, and I teach composition, English 101, 101B, and then research writing, English 102 at CWI, and American Literature, 277, 278. It's early American literature, and then modern American literature, pretty much. Yeah, so this presentation is about retention. It started within CTL at CWI. Courtney Bond offered an opportunity to just tackle the problem of retention. And at CWI, that's something that instructors have to think about. And so that's where this presentation came from. So there's going to be kind of two parts to this. One is how to think about retention. Part of the research here was actually constructing a right model for thinking about retention in my classroom. So that's part of it. And then the main part really is the focus on the checklist, right? So like how to implement that mental model and why checklists are really, really important. And they kind of mutually reinforce one another. Can't really have one without the other. So I want to get a baseline here because we all come from different backgrounds, and I think this is part of why the checklist can be really useful. We have so many different educational backgrounds. You teach a college course, which the following describes your savviness as an instructor the most. So many of you are probably a combination of all three, but which one seems to identify you the most? So A, most of what I know about teaching comes from my undergraduate or graduate education. Maybe you have a degree, a minor. B, most of what I know comes from my job experience. I learned by teaching. C, most of what I know about teaching comes from professional training I did throughout my career. How many of you would say A? Andrea?
Wow. Maybe that's the wrong answer.
No.
That's the right answer. You're the only one.
I'm sticking with it.
No.
Stay with it. Final answer.
I know a number of instructors at CWI who would probably also say A. It's really interesting. But that speaks to, I think, the demographic that's in here. B, most of what I know comes from my job experience. I don't know teaching. How many of you would say B? So, okay. About 55%, 50%, maybe. See, most of what I know I take comes from professional training. I did it throughout my career. It's like 30%, something like that. I'm probably mostly C, and then some would B. I took a 2-credit course in grad school on while I was beginning to adjunct as part of my PhD program, and that was the extent of my educational background, right? And so that's some of the training that some instructors have. That's it. There's a lot of different variations here. All right, and so I think this gets to the retention dilemma. We come from different backgrounds. Some of us do not have the privilege of Andrea and her in-depth knowledge of education, right? So traditionally, I don't know when it's a little ski there. Traditionally, higher ed instructors have viewed themselves as content experts first and educators second. I don't know if you identify yourselves in that way, but that's probably how I would identify myself, right, traditionally. But this identity often conflicts with the needs of the actual student. This is, you kind of see this like a stage on the stage, model of teaching in that cartoon. I just want to provide get a baseline here for what I mean by, when I think about retention, what kind of students am I trying to keep in my class? Who do I have in mind? There's different ways of thinking about what at-risk or high-risk means, and so I do want to provide some examples. And I'm speaking from experience. These are different names from actual students. The stories I've kind of changed the details to make them anonymous, but these are based on real stories. So Sarah, after high school, she joined the Army. She did a stint in Afghanistan and Iraq, so she's a combat veteran. After coming home to Idaho, she was diagnosed with PTSD. She's also a single mother with 2 children, and she's the first of her family to attend college. That means she's working class, according to the sociologists. She's a hardworking student, especially in the first half of the semester. But around week 7, she stopped submitting assignments. Week 6, 7 is like a typical week for a lot of students. When asked about it, she says her anxiety has gotten worse. She's honest about this, and then she stops coming to class by week 9. Adam, both of his parents attended college and are solidly middle class, unlike Sarah. But since coming out as gay in late high school, he lost his family support. This is true for many LGBTQ individuals in the Treasure Valley. Recently, he enrolled at both BSU and TWI. Again, this is true for a lot of students. Increasingly, taking on 15 credits. He kept up with the work until week 8, when he became the victim of domestic violence. All too common. He subsequently found himself unable to focus on schoolwork. By week 10, he dropped all but 1 course. Then finally, Tabitha, a 40-year-old student with history of drug and alcohol use in 2016. She was in a car accident, received a TBI, traumatic brain injury. She didn't have health insurance at the time, and so she wasn't properly diagnosed. She doesn't even know that she has a disability. She wanted to use that language if you had a conversation with her. She's an excellent drive. She's a hard worker, but due to her TBI, she has trouble processing, cognitive processing, probably short term especially. And then she has trouble organizing lecture material, her own thoughts, writing essays. A lot of it's logical processing, right? By the middle of the course, she feels it will be impossible. She can't do as well as her students, so she drops out. So when I think about like high-risk students, these are some of the students I have in mind. Very different backgrounds. They are all at risk of dropping out, right? Does anyone have like another quick anecdote? Some common students you have in mind when you're like, hey.
So I have a fair number of students from other countries.
Okay.
And for some of them, processing the English presentation that I do is a real difficulty.
Okay.
And they will get part of the way through the semester. I had one this last semester who really struggled with the technology. She just could not submit projects, she couldn't submit assignments.
Yep.
By the middle of the semester, she was a lost child. So it took a lot of work to help her get through.
So about literacy and visual literacy
Yes,
for that student.
computer literacy, visual literacy, auditory literacy. She is from Africa, so it was a real combination.
Yep, for sure. One more.
I have an example. I'm a working nurse. I've been in it for almost 13 years and don't have an advanced degree yet. I'm really resistant going to do the master's. I value the clinical setting, but to go into a lot of different positions, you kind of have to have an advanced degree. And so I did take on going into a master's program. And so for the first couple of courses, really struggled with how does this apply to real life. And so got through the stuff, but you know, at first it was kind of reinforcing my thought about what it was going to be. It was just kind of a stepping stone you had to do. But I've actually found that the more I've been in it, the more I can find it relates to other things.
Yeah.
So like, you know, teaching students and things like that. So actually, I'm finding a lot more relation to actually real life, I guess, is what, you know, it's not just school.
Right.
You know, there's sometimes I've heard people say in the clinical setting, if you can't do, you teach. And so there's a little bit of a negative, you know, there's sometimes a negative, which it's not true. I don't believe that's true at all. But anyways, so sometimes your ideas about coming into the education can impact how well you do.
For sure.
Especially if you're struggling with real life situations. So.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks. Okay, so the individual cases vary. Well, we heard different accounts. I'm sure if we have more time, I would love to hear even more stories. But I guess you know, educational experts would say these are all different risk factors that these students have: behavioral disorders, psychological disorders, low or high. Interestingly enough, socioeconomic status, so the extremes, perceived cultural stigmas, unusual social behavior. These are all different risk factors, right? But these refer to a wide variety of students. I think that's what's so difficult in the classroom. It depends on the course. It could be, if it's a gen ed course out of the community college, it could be up to 30, 40% of your class might fall on the spectrum somehow, right? How do you manage all those at once? Like, do you keep track of every single risk factor and then try to target that on a case-by-case basis, like throughout the entire semester? Well, what does that look like? How much time does that take, especially if you're an adjunct, right? Our time is valuable. So the dominant approach to managing students most likely to drop out is cataloged and fixed. So I'm going to suggest this is what's currently in place. This is a generalization, but for the purposes of this demonstration, that's all it matters. So this is the dominant approach, and with this approach, we want to catalog various at-risk behaviors. Like we undergo training, or maybe student services. They have a system that will catalog at-risk behaviors and then fix on a case-by-case basis. Increasingly, this is done outside the classroom. So right here, I mean at-risk students is increasingly done by students by some kind of support services, right? There's technology that comes into play. Instructors will report things that they see, and then they'll aggregate that information, right? And then make a decision, oh, let's target this student, right? The instructor actually does not do that much other than reports in this scenario, right? And I think one of the outcomes of this is really important. I'm going to come back to this later on in the presentation. I think that plays a massively important role. But I think one of the unfortunate outcomes is we feel like we have less control over actually addressing the problem in the classroom, right? That's one of the outcomes. It divides another risk here if we use the language of identifying, of cataloging at-risk students. If we start to see students say, oh, at risk, I report them at risk, or I see them at risk, we start to see other students as not at risk, right? And so it divides classes, students into at-risk versus non-risk students. Is that a useful dichotomy to retain? So in disability studies, I teach in the humanities, and one of the critical theories we use is disability studies, and increasingly we're trying to use the idea abled and disabled, to kind of interrogate that dichotomy and try to rethink what it means to be an able person, right? Or possibly always, to what extent are we always becoming disabled and able at the same time? And I think there's a corollary here with risk and non-risk. So I'm going to argue for a different ecological approach. This is the mental model. And then I'll show how a checklist is one of the best ways to implement this. Okay, so in many ways, each college course is a risk environment. And so I want to think about college classrooms as environments and focus on the classroom as a space and not just on individual students. And I think there's a lot of overlap between medical clinics, interestingly enough, and our classrooms. And I think this is increasingly the case, for better and worse. And so our goal in both medical clinic and in the classroom is to foster wellness. That language is increasingly applied to the academic environment, right? We foster wellness. We don't just teach content anymore. I think this is due to a number of reasons. With the shift to engaged learning, focusing on student outcomes, learning practices, habits, and routines, and not just running content. Eric, you mentioned this in your presentation, right? Yeah. This is part of that shift. There's also an expansion of Title IX. We've seen a lot of success with expanding Title IX and what that means. Originally applied to mainly athletics, and then expanded to other areas, especially in the late 90s. I think that also attaches more responsibilities to individual instructors. We're responsible for more, right? We feel like we are responsible for more. And the reality, what's hard here, is that in reality, we interact with uncertainty. So we're supposed to foster wellness. We're responsible for more and more, increasingly. And yet we have more and more uncertainty. So the response is to treat, right? Come up with a treatment that bridges the gap between goal and reality. So within the medical community, Atul Gawande shows how, to bridge that gap between the goal of fostering wellness and then a space within uncertainty reigns, risk reigns, checklists are really, really effective. I want to play a brief excerpt here. I'm going to outsource my talking. Just about a minute and a half to give you a sense of where I'm coming from. I'm trying to think about how I originally heard about the Checklist Manifesto. That's the book that Atul Gawande is really famous for. But he also did a TED Talk on this. I assume this is going to work. Where's Jesse, just in case? All right, you know what? I'm not gonna. It's not gonna work. All right, Jesse's not here, so I'll kind of fill in. So basically, in this minute and a half, Atul Gawande explains hey, they were seeing a lot of complications in operating rooms, right? They were doing operations, seeing different complications, and they wanted to reduce the probability of those complications actually happening, right? And so they went to the airline industry, other industries that dealt with risk on a consistent basis, and they're like, hey, what do you use to deal with all this complexity? And what they learned from the airline industry was that checklists were some of their go-to, even beyond advanced technology, checklists had a really, really important role. And so Atul Gawande, along with other surgeons, developed simple checklists to codify the process for operating rooms, right? So when you go into an operating room, it's really, really basic. They would start by introducing one another, right? And so this is kind of the start, step one before, maybe wash your hands, step into the room, and then introduce one another. So the doctor, all the nurses, anesthesiologists, everyone else. That's an important step. And so they have different pause points in the operating procedure and suggestions for what to do next. And you just check off, did you do this, did you do this, so on and so forth. This is the checklist they developed. For example, before induction to anesthesia, before skin incision, before patient leaves operating room. This is very procedural. right? And you have things like, read and then confirm. For example, confirm all team leaders, team members have introduced themselves by name and role, right? So it seems very basic. But one thing he says in this talk that I think is really important, and I think this speaks to like our responsibilities, what we can actually do in the classroom. He says you can't make a recipe for something as complicated as surgery. Instead, you can make a recipe for how to have a team that's prepared for the unexpected. So I think that language is really important. We can't make a recipe for something as complicated as teaching. You can't have that kind of checklist. What we want is a recipe for preparing for the unexpected. And so I think this is the shift to thinking about, okay, how can we create environments within which risk is properly managed? And so that's what I'm going to propose, a mental model for actually doing that within the classroom. Any questions about this part, the checklist manifesto and tool? Is anyone else familiar with Gawandhi's work? I'm curious, what context within what context?
Creating a surgical site checklist. Yeah, so actually our entire organization, it was one of our required reads.
What organization?
It's when I was with the University of Kansas Health System.
Health system, sure. Awesome.
I run Being Mortal.
Being Immortal?
Oh, that's a good one.
That's a great one too.
Yeah.
Okay. Anyone else? Yeah.
I'm not familiar with his work, but I have a medical background, and so with each of these set questions, you get an answer to eliminate variabilities when a problem does occur. Right. That's all.
I think that's part of the beauty of checklists is to reduce noise, right? Like what to block out, what's not important, and isolate what is important. It's part of the key here. So benefits. This is part from Gawandhi, part from just me thinking this through. Benefits of any good checklist: creates a safe environment. That's the ultimate goal, right? Fosters teamwork. This is Gawandhi highlights this again and again, especially in developing a checklist. This is like one of the most important parts is the process of constructing a checklist, right? Just following one is not good enough. It's all about the entire process from beginning to end. Encourages discipline. I think it does take each individual instructor has to think about, I guess, their ego to some extent. Like, hey, what do I have control over? What do I want to to some extent outsource to my community's shared knowledge, right? It does take a little bit of humility. Frees up working memory. This is, for me, really increasingly really valuable. I don't want to have to think constantly about behavioral management. Right? Doesn't I didn't sign up to teach high school. At the same time, I am teaching a lot of students who have a lot of needs. So something in between is what I'm looking for. Cheap. This is for administrators, but also instructors save money implementing this. It's not free because it takes time, but compared to IT services, a lot more technology, it's cheap. Technology is very expensive. All right. So how did we try to implement this at CWI? I'm just going to show my example. And then this is where I'm going to get into the background research that I use for the checklist. Let me hand this out right now. So this is, there's 2 pages here. It should be a front and back is how I, ideally would print this out. You'd be able to hand this to another instructor, or just hold on to it and say like, okay, early semester, I'm gonna look on the front. After the semester starts, I'm gonna look on the back, ideally. I'll get to the design later, but I just wanna clarify that real quick there. Okay, so how is a higher ed checklist going to be different from like an operating environment checklist. What's going to be the difference, right? There's a lot of beauty to checklists, but I think it's a different beast when we get to the classroom environment. And so what I'm going to argue, this is where I'm going to argue for a different mental model. We should manage risk with the goal of fostering a resilient ecology. Is anyone familiar with Inouye's anti-racist ecology? You heard that? Joy?
Sorry.
Yeah. Can you briefly summarize what he means by an ecology?
Yeah, I mean, he's talking about how everything in a classroom and the assessments, the way that the instructor and the student interact is set up in a way, in his case, what he's talking about specifically is anti-racist, is his goal within a writing classroom, which is a really difficult thing to do because standardized written English is very much associated with white middle class English, they're almost not distinguishable. So when you're working with students who are not white and middle class or have not had access to standardized written English, asking them to produce it is in and of itself asking really too much.
So
how do you balance that requirement essentially of the institution and create an ecology of a classroom that is not being negative?
Yeah, so when we're talking about classroom management, we're thinking about power. There's one of the things within governance, right? These are things that impact our students and allow us to actually be efficacious in them. We have power, we need that power to actually act and help our students, right? But what Inouye argues is, hey, we need to think about the powers operating within an ecology, and we need to think about how all of these practices collectively produce either a racist or an anti-racist ecology. And so what I'm going to suggest is that we should think in similar ecological terms, but in terms of resilience. That should be our goal if we're going to focus on retention. And so this is the research that went into the front page, especially. You'll see footnotes. When I was researching for this project, I eventually learned to focus on studies that looked at resilience practices or practices that helped foster resilience, right? And there's different senses here, that term can actually apply to individual students or the classroom in general. This is Mark Zimmerman. There's a lot of experts that do deal with this theory, resilience theory. Who's the TED Talk? Really famous for her TED Talk. Duckworth.
Angela Duckworth.
Yes.
Grit.
Grit, right? So grit, you may be familiar with that idea. That is part of resilience theory. It's a subset of that. It operates within that theory. So a burgeoning area of research focuses on the cumulative effects of multiple promotive factors across ecological domains. And I guess keep in mind here how this is different from the categorize an individual and then fix that on a case-by-case basis. This is thinking about a cumulative effect. And then a resiliency paradigm aims to cultivate positive factors that increase strength overall. The strength of the classroom, right, of one domain. The classroom, and not just each individual student, but the classroom as a whole, becomes a resilient ecology. I'm going to argue that's the main goal here. And so it operates through a cluster effect. And again, this is what the front page is going to be all about. If you look at this, it says, before the semester begins, review each of the following evidence-based practices. When implemented together, these are shown to have a cluster effect in promoting resilience among high-risk students. And so the idea here is to be able to check these off, looking at your lesson plans, looking at your syllabus, looking at your major assignments. And at the beginning of the semester, by the first week for sure. And if you're able to check these off, you should have a cluster effect, right? And just being able to check these off should, in theory, help create a resilience ecology, right? That's part of the idea behind the design of the front. So things like, I don't know if you're familiar with some of this language, cultivate internal locus of control. I think something that's similar with Duckworth, like the intrinsic motivation, isn't that her language? intrinsic motivation. So that speaks to the internal locus of control. Students need to feel like they have power and control over their success, right? And so things like scaffolding assignments begin the first week of class with really simple tasks, and that students know how to complete is actually really extremely highly effective and really important to promoting resilience, right? Because it helps build that internal locus of control. Improve attention. So when we think about attention, I mean, that's a big idea. We think about CBT, we think about mindfulness in the classroom. All these practices can help foster resilience in the classroom, right? If it improves attention. Students become a source of knowledge, so students learning to teach other students has a role here. I think, so Eric also mentioned this in his engaged classroom presentation. And then foster a sense of community. So for me, this is one of the most important factors that I found in my experience. Just taking a lot of time to have conversations with the class about what kind of like community you want to have. Joey mentioned like you kind of explain what anti-racist ecology means for anyway, but you know, just kind of thinking about like the language that we use in the classroom, especially in this place that's highly important. How to respond to other people, modeling that, practicing that, especially early on in the semester. All right, so just want to highlight the design here. You can't see on the left-hand side, it's supposed to say ecology. I wonder if I can fix that. I'm not gonna try. Left-hand side is ecology, right-hand side is categorizing and fix. And so I do think categorizing and fixing just have an important role. At CWI, we have a program called CARE, in which we can report concerns about individual students. Student Services then uses that information. They'll see how many reports they get on any one particular student, and then they'll maybe give them a call, or if it's domestic violence or other Title IX situation, they'll have other protocol for addressing that particular case. And so that does have a role here, right? But that's happening within this ecology. It's kind of the key shift, I think. Does BSU have something that's analogous to CARE?
We have CARE.
Same thing, okay. I guess let's look at some of the procedures here we talked about before the semester begins. Let's look at some of the procedures here. And this would get into more like traditional checklist territory. And this is where like I had a lot of conversations with other instructors, Courtney Bond at CTL, May Newberry, who is a really amazing composition instructor at CWI. And she helped me with some of this language, but this is kind of what we came up with. Once the semester started, so this would be on the back of the checklist, use the following behaviors to identify potentially high-risk students. Right? And here, so I guess I want to point out that at this point in the semester, I'm assuming all my students carry a risk, but maybe I'm starting to see signs like actually surface, right? Some students are showing behaviors with the class late. Maybe they can't submit an assignment as well, like Eric mentioned, due to ESL or digital literacy issues. If so, I'd say I can mark them as being a risk at that point, right? If you are able to mark a student in that way, you'll see that the second half of this is suggestions for response strategies. And so this is more like an operating room at this point, more targeted. So after identifying a high-risk student, how do you mark the students in fashion? Courtney Bond's helping with this area. Initially, in my kind of checklist, I suggested actually taking notes on the encounter and like saying like, hey, we had this conversation. This, they said this, I said this. We came up with this plan, et cetera, et cetera. And she cautioned me that teacher notes can actually be subpoenaed in court. And so even like when you're recording and thinking about your conversations with other students, do keep in mind that those conversations can be subpoenaed. And so it might be helpful to, like, I guess make note of an encounter, but be, intentionally vague in some cases if you want to protect their privacy. and maybe just, talk about the goals that you agreed upon, something like that, right? After a particular instance, have you followed up with each high-risk student in order to discuss the strategy? Again, each instances, we're looking for behaviors, failed performance, that kind of stuff, right? This is operating, it's assuming that the cluster effect has already happened, but then particular students, maybe something happens, right? An emergency, whatever. And then there's different steps after that, after a little no improvement. This is where care comes into place, concern reports. You might follow a concern report. If you don't hear anything back, there's another failed performance. We can try to recontact, and then there's suggestions for, hey, if you do see improvement, make sure to highlight that. It's just intuitive, teaching / parenting practices, I suppose. Any questions about this so far? I am going to have some time for critiquing a procedure.
I don't have a question. I do just want to say that example email language from the second bullet under after identifying a high-risk student is one I think lots of faculty have a lot of luck with for a couple of reasons.
Yeah.
It doesn't presume on the part of the instructor that the student is unmotivated or lazy or is acting out against them, which is really easy to do with an instructor. How can you be late to my class every single day? Have you no respect for me? And because it comes across as I just noticed this, what is preventing you from? A lot of times the student doesn't get defensive in a way that they can if you just are so what's up with you being tardy all the time or whatever. Right. So it's really nothing else I don't think you should do, but even if so, that, some of the templates for language in here is awesome.
Yeah, that's what they make. So yeah, being able to, I think this is where the operating room checklist is really useful, is that sometimes we, again, have a range of educational backgrounds. Some instructors will know what language is the most tactful, whereas others just don't have the experience or don't have the training to formulate the same kind of email. We should share that knowledge, and checklists can actually do that, right? Any other comments on the procedure or the ecology part?
Just on the language, I actually am reading a book right now called Social Conversations.
Yeah.
And it's pretty helpful to give a framework for those conversations that can be really, they're avoided a lot of the time because people don't know how to handle them. They're so key and so valuable when you actually approach them correctly. So anyways, for growth on the part of the person, on all parties involved, that's a great book.
Well, and I like that because Social Conversations is used, I think, also in businesses and the medical community,
Everywhere,
right?
yeah.
And so maybe I didn't use that as part of the my background knowledge. So if you're going to develop a checklist for your department, I would assume that's something you could do. Find a place for make that more deliberate on your part. I like that. Okay, so here's my kind of final argument for the checklist. The retention checklist informs my resilience ecology. I think that's key. I'm arguing that mental model is key to making this work. It places more emphasis on individual instructors, right? Kind of balances things out a little bit. Categorizing and fixing, care reports are indeed the future, absolutely. At the same time, instructors, we want to feel like we have more control over our classroom. What can we do, right? So just some bullet points, cluster effects creates many safe environments on campus. And increasingly, that's an important thing to do. All students are treated as having both risks and strengths. I think I'm personally trying to move away from categorizing my students it's not true. Categories to some extent are really important. I'm trying to remember that every one of my students has risk. And every one of them, even the most disabled or seemingly disabled, has strengths, right? And so what models can I use to highlight those basic foundations, right? Risk and strength. Every student has this. Categorize and fix still plays a limited role. Again, we're thinking from the point of view of the instructor, right? Individual instructors have greater impact on retention. Ultimately, I think adopting something like this model and checklist format can help us actually do what the college and university wants to do. They want to see that retention rate. I know at CWI they want to have an average retention rate of at least 80%, I believe is one of the goals, is the most recent goal. What can instructors do? This can't all be captured by care, I assume, right? So just being able to define what the responsibilities of the instructors are and what we can do, I think is important. So this is just going to end by showing you how this was piloted at CWI. This was not part of the master's or PhD. I didn't do data collection on this. I did not devote that time to it, but I devote a lot of like qualitative time to it. So this started last year, so February 2017. I did a research and retention project, and this is the first draft of the checklist was developed around that time. Show you. I would like to show you what that draft looks like so you can see how different it is, but I'm not an expert on.
Is the first draft a link?
Yeah, it's a link, yeah.
Sometimes if you hit control and then click it, it'll open up the link.
Well, so when I do that, it does pull it up. I'm not sure how to get it on the actual display.
Oh.
It's honestly not.
It's just PowerPoint, nothing else.
Yeah.
If it's something on your computer, but just slide it over, it might be like a second screen.
You take the window.
Yeah. Let's try it. So, I don't know what you're doing.
It's like the arrows at the,
Yeah.
bring your pointer down.
Put your arrow
There's arrows down in your corner screen.
in the left corner.
Left corner? Oh, right here? Oh, I see what
Yeah.
you're saying. Okay, let's try that. This is not going to be as exciting as the labor is suggesting it will be. Whoa. No, that's just the presentation. Look at this.
Yeah.
Okay, well, if Jesse comes back, maybe he'll save you. All right. So the first draft was really different. It was just like an old school table, and just kind of like it was a 3-column table, and it had like early semester practices, middle semester practices, and then, like just responding to individual students. Design-wise, it was a little difficult to follow. I'm not going to refer to it that much. Okay. By April 2017, after conversations with Courtney Bonds and Megan Newberry especially, we developed a second draft of the checklist. It was closer to what you see here. I included the research at that point. And then by August, the next fall, I sent it out to 10 English faculty members. Most of those were full-time faculty. I would say maybe a third of those or a fourth of those had education degrees. And I think this is, I'll show the qualitative feedback. This is something to keep in mind. This is really important. And here, right, we are more content experts, I would say, right? Whereas at CWI, especially in the English department, you're going to get more faculty proportionally going to have a background in education, which is helpful for developing the checklist for sure. By January 2018, so after they piloted it, used it throughout the semester, I asked for qualitative feedback, and then I constructed the final draft based on that feedback. And that's what you see here today. So what instructors said, parts that were intuitive for some were illuminating for others. I think this is really, this was one of my important takeaways here. Even if we're even if we see ourselves as primarily instructors, primarily educators, what's intuitive for us is not intuitive for other instructors, especially if we have different training, right? And so I think the beauty of checklists is that they share that implicit knowledge. Right? Some instructors did say, who piloted this, said like, oh, I felt like this was intuitive. Other instructors said, oh, I found this really, really beneficial. And both would have advanced degrees in education. What's common sense in a given environment, right? Most found the checklist highly useful for how to think about high-risk students. I'm suggesting it helps to have a different model, or a model at least, some kind of mental model in mind. What's your goal? What kind of environment do we want to create? That should be that should guide the checklist process. Maybe you don't go with resilient ecology, but you have another model to replace that. Some wanted even more step-by-step guidance on the front side of the checklist. Let's look at that real quick. I mean, this gets into design. There's only so much space on this, and there's so much information already. Someone wanted even more like, hey, let's see, accurate feedback. Can you provide details about what that means? It says, does your feedback on their work accurately appraise students about their weaknesses and strengths? You do that, right? That's a really good practice. Students, this fits into the growth mindset, right? This is part of having a growth mindset. I wouldn't say it's kind of a sub-practice or a reinforcing practice, but students need to know, like, hey, I'm not where I should be at this point in time. Right? Praise alone is not helpful. It's not useful. At the same time, how do we actually leave feedback? That's a massive. There's books for it, right? And so, how detailed does this checklist need to be? Is it enough to just say, do this? I don't know. The ecology, the front side is mainly practices, whereas the back side is steps. That's one way to think about the difference. Right? Practices that should be in place before the semester starts, at the very beginning of the semester, versus steps to take when high-risk behavior starts. That's how we see the division. So just in closing, benefits that I saw just personally my takeaway here. So just developing the I think I would encourage you to develop this like your own kind of checklist. Using your own theory, using your own research, the whole process is immensely beneficial. Again, I kind of suggested just sharing knowledge, seeing that knowledge shared in an organized way, and in a way that like it fell on a single page. I think there's something magical about that. Like we have so many conversations with other faculty members, so many water cooler conversations, but like where does that information end up? And how much do we benefit from those conversations, right? Can we crystallize that to some extent? I think checklist developing those can be highly useful. And then also interrogates common sense. I already suggested how it did that. I believe, so I have a couple questions for you. And this is just open-ended questions as well. So what's missing? I think I already suggested this one gap that came up in the survey was just having more examples for each of the resiliency practices. They are practices, they're not steps. So what specific things do you do to address retention? And if you already do things to manage students who are at risk or at high risk, like would they fit on that front page, or am I missing something? Does it fit within the resiliency ecology, or am I missing a practice? And then I don't have training in design, so if someone does have that background, I'm looking for input as well, how to make this clearer, cleaner, easier to use, more intuitive. All right. So those are the two questions I have for you, or if you just have, I guess, questions in general.
To the extent that I can do this, because I got big classes, what I'm looking for is engagement. Just looking for students who just aren't engaged. So they're there.
Yeah.
But, and then we have team exercises, and are they engaged with your team? And so I'm not sure what I'm doing is effective enough. So, and like I'll just go, if I know somebody's engaged, particularly in the first few classes, I'll just go, while the team exercise is going on, I'll just go sit down right next to them and say, you okay? What's going on? And try to start up a conversation, but I'm not sure that I'm using the right words, maybe. Really kind of put them under a little bit of stress. Saying, there's an expectation of engaged here. So I don't know. Maybe I use too many you messages, and maybe I should use an I message or something.
And that's in front of the rest of the students though?
Well, I'm not talking to them other than just quietly. No, I'm not. Calling somebody out. I've done that. Although when somebody comes in late, you go sit down.
They're present sitting there might not be the most positive.
Engagement. I guess one of my questions is, so engagement learning, that's something that like we get trained in or we're familiar with. And there's a big push towards engagement learning. It's a really nice fit when we think about home-based education, right? And so, my question is, does engagement learning fit within the resilience ecology? Is it represented by that front page? Or do I need to add new practices to bring that into the conversation, to promote that? Can I make that part of the cluster effect? Or is that a separate model? I guess one.
I can see it. Yeah, go ahead. First piece is your checklist to get ready for class, right? If I read it right, whereas he's talking about when you're executing in class, right? The daily.
Well, how do you identify? Because, some people don't have very few testing opportunities or individual. We got big classes, which is my challenge.
What does it mean to be disengaged? What does it look like to be disengaged?
So I judge it based on engagement.
But exactly what are you looking for?
Do you do peer reviews on your group projects?
I don't, but I was thinking that might be a thing to do.
So someone else showed me how to do this because it was so not my thing. But it's from the business department at Boise State, and they've got a peer review model that you can, for every group assignment I do, I make them do a ranking of participation and the strengths of each, how did this team member contribute to your overall project? And because I don't know any of my students, I also make them take a selfie and upload it with their group. And I have some hope that someday I'll always be able to remember their names. But then I also count my number of people to make sure, there's 9 people in the group and no one's accidentally, covering for someone else or something. But I look for the people that are always ranked, like, you've been the 9th least contributor in your group the last 4 weeks, and they see that feedback. So I don't know if that's actually negative, maybe inadvertently but it's how I know they're participating. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that, so the 4th step on once the semester started is on the back. Use the following behaviors to identify potentially higher students. It says, do they have difficulty communicating with others? Maybe that speaks to, that could be engagement, but it could also be ESL, ELL issues, right?
What you want to do is you want to catch them, but sometimes their performance drops off mid-semester, and then they just disappear. And so, but if you're not, dependent on how often you're getting reviews, you're doing reviews on them, or how often you can do reviews, you might be close to the end of the semester before you catch it. So,
and hopefully the ecology is in place to minimize how many times. It's kind of the goal. So we're out of time. I don't want to use it 3 times. So thanks for coming. And if you have any other questions, if you want to talk, I'll stick around. Otherwise, I know what other things to do. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
How did that work? Good, yeah. The only thing I was trying to play, and I'm actually glad because you didn't have a lot of time. I didn't know how to play like a video and show that on the front board. Yeah.
Yeah, it was just organized when we turned on the system here.
Yeah.
And it should have worked, but for whatever reason, it wasn't.
I couldn't get like another screen to show up.
Oh, serious?
Yeah, like it was only showing the slide. I couldn't, when I clicked on a link, I couldn't show the other link. Yeah. I couldn't show the other screen.
Oh, I see what you're saying. I got you. I'm sorry.
No, it works out.
Are these your extras? Because I would like one. I didn't
Yeah.
sit in it.